He can turn on you so fast.
Oh, like that. Like that.
Okay, I hit the record button, so unless you want it on the, thank you. Good evening.
That was last night.
Yeah, stop taking those pills.
Good morning. One day I'll get a professional to edit the videos and then it'll start in the right spot. Okay. So we've mentioned many times that these days, it's much easier for someone to understand when we say God sees and hears everything. That doesn't mean you have to believe in God. I'm saying the concept that God can see and hear everything is more relatable because in much of the world and in much of our lives, there really isn't anywhere that we're unseen. And this is by man-made machinery. So if there is a divine power out there, its ability to see everything is not that far-fetched. It's very much relatable. And the Alter Rebbe is going to start with a Mishnah that we learned in Ethics of Our Fathers. We've mentioned it before, that if you think about three things, you will never sin. And one of them is that or two of them, that there's an eye that sees everything, there's an ear that hears everything, and everything is written down in a book. And one day, Judgment Day, everything will be open and fair game. Anything you say or do can be used against you in a court of law. And because God can see and hear everything, so anything you do during your lifetime will eventually be used in your judgment. But here's the problem. The problem is, how can we say that God sees and hears everything? We know one of the tenets of our faith is that God doesn't have a physical body or a physical form. So there is no ear and there is no eye. So then what does it mean that God sees and hears everything? And this question is not just on this mission. This question is on so many verses in the Torah. God's mighty hand and outstretched arm and God's anger and all of these things that are very much connected to a physical form or body. If God doesn't have it, how can we say it? So the answer that's given, or one of the answers that's given, one way of understanding it is that usually when we say God's hand or God's arm, how do we imagine that? We imagine it automatically based on our arm. So our arm looks like this. God's arm must look like this too. Maybe it's infinitely bigger, but really it's the other way around. It's not that God's arm looks like our arm. God wasn't created in our image. We were created in God's image. So the fact that we have an arm, now it's my job to figure out, how does this look like God's arm if God doesn't have an arm like this? So every limb in the body has a function. Every limb in the body that has a function, there are the good parts of the function and not bad parts, but the limitations of the function. So let's take an eye that we're talking about now. What are the positives of the eye, of the function of the eye?
You can see.
It can see things outside of the person. Yeah, it can see things far away sometimes. What are its limitations?
Doesn't have a zoom lens.
Doesn't have a zoom lens. It can't see the back of its head. It can't see out of its peripheral view.
Can't see in the dark.
Can't see in the dark. There are many limitations to the eye. If God created the eye, in other words, God is the perfect eye, so God has all the advantages of an eye without the disadvantages of the eye. Yeah? So God can see, and he doesn't have a blind spot. There isn't, a peripheral view. There's the entire view. There isn't the back of the head that's outside of its view. Doesn't need glasses. His eye doesn't deteriorate, etc. Yeah. But does he have a physical eye? Of course not. If he would have a physical eye, that would be limiting. So when we say God has an eye that sees, it doesn't mean a physical eye that sees. It means the ability to see. You need a physical eye. We need a physical eye to see because we're physical beings. God doesn't need a physical eye. So God has a spiritual eye, not an object. But when we say God has an eye, it means the ability to see without its limitations. So how does it work? How does God see without an eye? So the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us that there's another thing that God has similar to us, so to speak, that we have similar to God, and that is knowledge, not information, but acquiring knowledge, knowing something. How do you know that you have to see a doctor for an itch on your back if you can't see it?
Because no home remedies work.
No,
Because you feel it.
you feel it.
And no home remedies work. But you know there's an issue because you feel it. You can't see it, but you know it's there. Now, because we're physical, we don't really know it's there or know what it is because we don't trust anything besides our eyes. Because our eyes are such good tools at observing information that if we can't see the itch on my back, I'm going to ask someone to look first. I'm going to try to look in the mirror. I'm not going to trust myself that there's something there 100%. I'll know there's something there. I know there's something that's wrong, but I won't know what it is, or I won't trust that it's 100% until I get visual confirmation. But we know we don't need visual confirmation. I know there's something there. Sometimes there could be something itching you or hurting you in a part of your body that you can see. There's nothing visible, but you know it's there. Why? Because you feel it. So the fact that you can't see it doesn't diminish it, but you know it's there. Why? How do you know it's there if you can't see it? Usually, if we can't see it, we don't know. So how do we know it's there if we can't see it?
Feel.
How do you feel?
How many feels different?
Because there's a soul. We're not necessarily talking about a divine, but there's life, right? There's life in your hand, and you could feel something's wrong. How do I know it's because of the soul that's there? Because what happens, God forbid, if there's a disconnect between the arm and the hand, are you going to feel the pain in the hand? No. In other words, when we say soul nefesh, we're talking about the nefesh, the soul that gives life to every part of the body. So if there's no life, if you have a dead limb, you're not going to feel pain in that dead limb. Yeah.
So you have your nerves are connected to your soul?
Your soul is in it's not connected. The soul isn't an object that the nerves are connected to. The soul is the life of the blood that flows through the veins and the energy that flows through all the parts of the body. That is the soul. It's not a physical thing, it's a spiritual thing. So in other words, how do you know there's pain there? Because you know yourself. And that's why if the limb is disconnected from you, you don't feel the pain because it's not yourself anymore. Now, if God forbid someone had a limb amputated and they woke up, would they know why it was amputated? Perhaps not. But if they looked at it, would they know why? Maybe, yeah. They look at it, they see the problem. But if they don't look at it, they don't know it because it's not part of them anymore. So if it's part of you, you know it. If it's not part of you, you need to see it. In other words, for us, seeing is limited to things outside of us. Of course, I want to see the itch on the back of my back, but I know it's there even if I can't see it. I know there's something there even if I can't see it. I know my toe is hurting even if I don't look at it, but I don't know that you're hurting unless I see you. Unless I see the problem or unless I see your face and I see that you're hurting. Yeah, I can't know that. The amazing thing is that when we talk about biological relationships, many times you couldn't know what's happening with the other person. A parent may know that there's something wrong with a child. They say it about twins, that sometimes they can feel what's going on with, even though you're separate, you don't see it, but because you share the same DNA, you feel it. It's like part of your soul. And the same thing, if we were spiritually in tune, we'd be able to feel the same thing about another person, about another Jew, because we have the same soul. We have a soul that's part of the same God. We share the same DNA, and therefore we'd be able to feel the other person's pain. And that's why we mentioned last week, or maybe it was by the Farbrengen, that a tzaddik can feel my pain sometimes more than I can feel it myself. Because the tzaddik is in tune spiritually with the soul, and the soul, there is no distinction between one person and the next. Well, there's a distinction, but there's no separation. So if I'm in tune with your soul more than you're in tune with your soul, I may feel your pain more than you do.
But that's your godly soul, not your animal soul.
Whatever. The only reason it's like that is because the animal soul is selfish. So my animal soul won't care about your animal soul. It's only my godly soul that will care. But technically, an animal soul is also a spark of the divine. Yeah. So, but yeah, you'd have to get your animal soul to stop being an animal before it could be interested in the other person. Okay. So in other words, there is a primal basic knowledge that a person has about themselves, and it's not because it's me. It's not because it's my body. No, it's because it's you. Because if God forbid, a person's limb was cut off, it's still their limb, and yet you don't feel it. So there's nothing to do with the fact that it's yours. And from a Jewish perspective, your body isn't yours because it's your soul. The soul is a piece of God. So it's not even yours, but it's not about being yours. It's about it's that it's you. It's that your soul is there. So when it comes to God, how does God see us? How does God know what we do? How does God know what's going on in our lives? Is it because he sees it, or is it because he knows it? We call it seeing because we see God as something separate. So God sees us, but he's not really seeing it. He knows it because it's his life. It's him that sustains us. We are all an extension of him. So he knows us just like any person knows themselves. Well, much more without the limitations, right? But God knows us just like we know ourselves. So again, the verse may refer to it as seeing, but it's not literally seeing, and it doesn't have the downsides of seeing, the limitations of seeing. So the fact that God knows what I'm thinking now, I can try to cover it up with a million coverings, but he's inside. Right? If you're going to try to block out someone's view and they have a camera inside, it's a futile endeavor. Yeah? There's a story of someone once asked one of the Chabad Rebbes why Chassidim daven so long. He said, we're trying to focus on God and think about God, and as long as the animal soul is throwing in other thoughts, we have to fight. We have to battle them out, and so that till our mind is clear, it takes time. So he said, I don't understand. If I'm traveling in the forest and the bandits are chasing me, I'm not going to go slower. I'm going to go faster. I'm going to try to outrun them. Mm-hmm. So the Rebbe said, yeah, that's if they're outside the wagon. But once they get in the wagon, not going to help you to go faster. Then you got to stop and fight them off. Then you can go. Yeah. So God is watching. We can't hide from that because whatever you do, whatever you try to do that God shouldn't watch you is all things assuming God is outside of you. But because God knows you just like he knows himself, there's nothing you could do to conceal that. Just like there's nothing you do to conceal from yourself except take drugs or alcohol. You're trying to hide yourself from yourself. You don't want to feel yourself. I don't mean that literally, but that's, in other words, that's the fallacy. That's the sort of the mindset of someone who's trying to hide from God. It's like the person who thinks they could stop feeling what they're feeling. You can't stop. You can mask it for a while, but you're only fooling yourself. Okay, let's see inside here. Time. Let's start from the paragraph before, from the middle of 638. As the rabbis of blessed memory said, reflect upon three things and you will not come to sin. Know what is above you, an eye that sees and an ear that hears. And although he has no bodily likeness, so how can we say God has an eye that sees and an ear that hears? On the contrary, in other words, this is the very reason that everything is revealed and known to him, infinitely more than, for example, through the physical medium of sight or hearing. Because he doesn't have an ear or an eye, therefore he doesn't need the ear and the eye, and therefore he could see and hear much better than we can. By way of illustration, God's seeing, in other words, we're using eye and hear just as a method of illustration. God's seeing and hearing, and the fact that everything is revealed to him and known by him, are like a man who knows and feels within himself all that is happening to and being experienced by each of his 248 organs, such as cold and heat. And when he puts his foot into the pool, even if he doesn't see it, even if he's blindfolded, he'll know if the pool's hot or cold, even though he can't see it. He'll know if it's fire or ice, even though he can't see it.
Maybe when you have neuropathy, you can't tell the difference between hot and cold.
Yeah, but that means there's a disconnect. There's a problem. That's when you know there's an illness. That's when you know there's a disconnect between the mind, between the soul, and the physical. And that's the whole point. As long as it's healthy, as long as you're connected, then you know exactly what it is. That's how you know that. That's why you go to a doctor, because it's not the way it should be. Feeling even the heat in his toenails, for example, as when he is scorched by fire. So also their essence and substance, and all that is affected in or by them is known to a person and sensed in his brain. Yeah, the person feels everything that happens, and because it's him. In a similar manner of knowledge, by way of analogy, God knows all that befalls all created beings of both higher and lower worlds, because they all receive their flow of life from him. As it is written, for from you come all things. And this is the meaning of what we say, and no creature is hidden from you, inasmuch as all created beings emanate from him. So therefore he knows everything, because it all comes from him, it's all him. And as Maimonides, speaking as a philosopher, has said, and this has been agreed to by the scholars of the Kabbalah, as Rav Moshe Cordovera writes in the Pardes, that by knowing himself, as it were, he knows all created things, whose source of existence is his true existence. Yeah, since the source of everything is from him, so the fact that God knows himself, he knows everything else automatically. Yeah, it's like the kid that once came home from school and he said, Dad, they wanted to hit me. Dad's like, how do you know they wanted to hit you? Do you have prophecy? They told you they want to hit you? It's like, no, because they hit me.
Yeah.
He's like, I know they wanted to hit me because they actually did. Yeah. So we need to know that. In order for us to know that they wanted to hit me, they have to actually hit me, because then I know it, because I feel it in myself. But if they don't actually hit me, I can't know. Now I could see them ganging up on me. I could maybe hear that they want to hit me. Do I know they want to hit me?
No, sure.
It seems. When do I know they want to hit me? When they actually hit me. It may look like fire, but there are people that can make all different types of illusions. When do I know it's fire? When I actually touch it and burn myself, or get close to it and feel the heat. I'm touching the heat, so to speak. Okay, so we establish that any type of comparison we want to make to God, it's a comparison only in the positive, not in the negative, right? There's nothing, none of the downsides of the comparison stick. What about comparing knowledge? The fact that we know something, the fact that God knows something, what's the downside of knowledge, so to speak? The fact that we compared, we said the fact, just like I know what's going on with me because I am me, God knows what's going on with me because I am part of God. I'm one with God. God's my life. What's the downside of that? What happens when I stub my toe and now I have a really bad day? My toe got hurt. Why do I have a really bad day? My toe should have a really bad day.
But that's part of you.
Because I, the soul, felt the stubbing of the toe or the burnt nail, as the example the Alter Rebbe gave. So because my soul knows it, because it's part of it, the soul can also be affected by it. So if the toe has a bad day, that might mean the soul will also have a bad day. What does it mean the soul has a bad day? My general disposition becomes one of tired and hurt. Because my soul isn't energized, it's hurt. Why is the soul hurt? The soul wasn't hurt. The toe was hurt. Yeah, but the toe is an extension of the soul. So the same way the soul knows what's happening to it because of its relationship and connection with the body, the things that affect the body affect the soul too. So if God knows me because God is my life, God is my soul. So when I sin or when I do something against God, seemingly that should affect God too. But that would be the negative of knowledge or the negative result of this type of knowledge. God isn't limited. It doesn't struggle with the negatives, only the positives. Because God's perfect. And therefore, the knowledge by God is done in a perfect and complete way. He created us not to be perfect. So he created knowledge within us that's very limited to the physical world we live in. And therefore, we can be affected by a physical body. We discussed last week. That's why we have to eat and sleep and drink, because the soul needs nourishment to, in other words, starving the body means the soul isn't as effective. When we have a fast day, the reason why we only fast these days on the prescribed fast days is because usually on a fast day, you're not as energized to study and to do things. That's why it's generally discouraged, even though for much of Jewish history, part of serving God was trying to conquer the body and trying to not destroy it, but conquer it, be in control of it. Part of that was controlling what you eat and when you eat it, etc. However, in the world, in God doesn't have that limitation. And therefore, we learn all the time. We say in the morning prayers, God wasn't changed by the creation of the world. It's the same God before, the same God now. Now, if God created something externally, what would be the big deal? Okay, he's a very strong person, so he didn't get tired by creating the world. Wouldn't be such a big deal. But if we're saying that God created the world as an extension of him, and therefore, when we beat each other up, it's God beating himself. It's hard to use those terms, but it's as if two parts of God are. Shouldn't God get tired by that? Shouldn't God get hurt by that? No. This doesn't mean that God doesn't care about what we do. The Torah says he gets upset when we don't listen. He gets happy when we do listen. But that care doesn't affect him. He doesn't change because of that care. Because that's a downside of caring. God doesn't have the downsides. God just has the upsides. What's the upside of caring? I can give you, I care about, there's a relationship. The downside of caring is when you're having a bad day, that may spill over to me. God doesn't have that problem. Let's see, 640. In a similar manner of knowledge, by way of analogy, God knows all that befalls all created beings of both higher and lower worlds, because they all receive their flow of life from him. As it is written, for from you come all things. And this is the meaning. Wait. No, I read this already. We're holding the second paragraph of 641, right? This analogy of the soul and body, however, is only to calm the ear, to make it possible for man's ear and intellect to perceive how one may know something about something without having to actually see or hear it. In truth, however, in other words, the analogy of knowledge is only used for the positive element that it brings out. In truth, however, the analogy of soul and body bears no similarity at all to the analogy of godliness and creation. Why? For the human soul, even the rational and the divine soul, is affected by the events which transpire with the body and its pain by reason of its, in other words, the rational and divine souls being actually clothed within the vivifying soul. In other words, the soul which provides the body with physical life, which in turn is clothed in the body itself. So my divine soul is in the same body and is clothed in the animal soul. The animal soul is in the body. So if the body affects the animal soul, the body affects the godly soul too. Even my divine soul can be affected by my body. And that's where the similarity ends. There is no, God isn't affected by the things I do, even though God isn't clothed within me, so to speak. God, however, is not, heaven forbid, affected by the events of the world and its changes, nor by the world itself. None of them affect any change in him, God forbid, nor in his absolute unity. Just as he was one and unified before he created them, so too does he remain one and unified after that creation. Just an example of God having the positives and not the negatives. So there was one of the great halachic, Talmudic sages of the previous generation, of Chaim Brisker. There's the Soloveitchik family. There was one here in Chicago and Yeshiva University, the Rav Yosheber Soloveitchik. So their father, Chaim, he once said about an experience he had at his bar mitzvah. His bar mitzvah was, a lot of people came. His father was one of the great rabbis at the time. And his father noticed that Reb Chaim was feeling a little good about himself, that so many people came for the bar mitzvah, for his bar mitzvah. So he went over to his son and he said, "You think all of these people came for you? They came for me. Don't get so excited." So the bar mitzvah boy turns to his father and says, if they all came for you, then why aren't there more people? So he said, "That's because of you." In other words, to have all the positives without the negatives. Yeah, okay. Obviously, he was just trying to teach his son a lesson. He wasn't saying it for real. It was just, he was telling him, don't get so excited by the first thing you perceive. You may want to think deeply about things in the future. Obviously, he didn't think that was, he only had the positives. With God, that's the case though. And we actually have this, where Maimonides says we should actually do this, that when we're educating our children or a teacher in the classroom, they can make themselves seem as if they're getting upset so that the kid learns right and wrong, but you shouldn't actually become angry. Why? Because you want to convey the message to the kid that what you're doing is upsetting, but that shouldn't be reason enough to lose control. God may appear to us in certain ways. That doesn't mean that it actually affects him internally. Okay. What we just said is basically a contradiction. Because the whole beginning part was how God is involved and invested and therefore knows everything that's going on, knows the thoughts that are recessed deep in my soul. But at the same time, it doesn't affect them at all. This seems to be, again, in our way of understanding, this seems to be a contradiction. It's hard for us to understand this. We're meant to understand. If we believe that God is sort of removed from the world, the fact that he isn't affected by the world is understandable. If we believe God is affected by the world, if we believe God isn't affected by the world, or that he's involved in the world, he should be affected by the world. And this question comes up many times. Maimonides discusses it. It's the type of question that gets in the way of free choice. If God knows everything that I'm going to do I really have free choice? Right? God knows what I'm going to do, so do I really have free choice? and but it's the same foundation that raises all of these types of questions. Yeah. So Maimonides in Mishnah Torah, he writes this question. It's broader than the world. The great scholars have dealt with it. Don't worry about it. This is the fact. It's all you have to know. Don't try to understand it. Other people have tried to explain or give explanations, etc. In Chassidus, the way Chassidus dabbles with this, the way Chassidus deals with this, we learned about it in chapter 2 of Tanya, is that there are two ways God relates to us. We just had this recently, Sovev Kol Almin, the way God surrounds all the worlds, and Mimale Kol Almin, sort of a ray of light that comes from God that invests itself in the world. So when we're talking about Mimale Kol Almin, the ray of light that invests itself within the world, that is affected. When we say God isn't affected, we're talking about Sovev Kol Almin. So really, we're talking about two different things. When we say God is affected, God isn't affected, we're talking about Sovev Kol Almin. When we say God is embedded, we're talking about Mimale Kol Almin. But that doesn't really answer the question. So that it's not the same God, so to speak, that's invested and that's not affected. But all of these explanations that are brought are all there to try to bring this as close as possible. At the end of the day, the Alter Rebbe is going to do something here that he doesn't do, I don't think, in the rest of Tanya, and you don't find very often in Chassidus. And that is, he's going to tell us that there is a point at which we say our human intellect can only get up to here, and you're just going to have to trust the rest. Logically, what we discussed here, this paradox, logically, you could see both sides of the coin. You just can't see how both sides can be both sides of the same coin. We don't know as humans, we can't bring both sides. They look like two different coins. They don't look like they can possibly be two sides of the same coin. We don't know how to make that marriage. Now, as humans, we know there are a lot of other things we don't know how we can do, right? Sometimes you look at two people getting married, you have no clue how they'll ever make it work. And then they do. But that was the problem in your understanding. It wasn't the problem in the actual marriage. The same thing here. The fact that we don't understand how God works doesn't make it a problem with God. It makes it a limitation of our understanding. It's almost like when your child gets upset that he doesn't understand what you're saying. He doesn't understand why you tell him he can't have 10 lollipops before he goes to sleep. And you just want to tell him, you're a child. There's no way you could understand. And we almost get upset or not upset, but like annoyed that the child thinks he should be able to understand. We don't expect a child to understand like 10 lollipops before they go to sleep is bad. Do you expect a child to understand that? If you do, then you have no clue what a child is. You may expect the child to listen, but can you expect the child not to want sweets? If you have that expectation, then you're not thinking about the child. So the fact that we want to understand God, the fact that we have this problem, this paradox, that's understandable. The fact that we expect to understand it, that's a complex that we have that's totally off. How can we expect to understand God? If God is the creator, how can we expect to understand him? If we'd understand him, we'd be him. Mm-hmm. Right? Like Alter Rebbe said, sitting around the table with his colleagues, and each one said what they would do differently in the world if they were God. Yeah, no children suffering, no this, that, everything they would take away. And it came to Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe was the youngest of the students of the Maggid. And Alter Rebbe said, if he was God, he'd do exactly what God's doing, because then he'd understand why God's doing it, and he'd do it the exact same way. The fact that we claim to think we can understand God is insane on its face. That doesn't mean we should try as much as possible, because God tells us in the Torah, as we mentioned in the last couple of weeks, know God. You should know, yet we have to try to know him as much as possible. But when we come to a roadblock, and it seems that what goes beyond that doesn't make sense, that shouldn't dismantle everything we built up to. The fact that you don't understand it means work harder. It doesn't mean that everything you did up until now is wrong. Yeah? The fact that science can't answer the question where the Big Bang came from, doesn't mean they're letting go of it. They're digging further and trying to understand where it came from, yeah, or how it came about. I could be outdated, but just as an example, yeah, the fact that you don't understand how to cure cancer doesn't mean you're not going to try harder. The person that gives up, we call it giving up. So just saying, okay, I don't understand it, and therefore it's not true, that's giving up. Assuming everything up until this point made sense. So work harder. And even if you'll never understand it, that doesn't mean you should give up. Okay. So in order to understand this, in order to, the second paragraph on 642, yeah, right before, a few lines before 27 Nisan or 23 Nisan, in order to help us understand this well with our intelligence, the scholars of truth, in other words, the Kabbalists, have already treated it at length in their books, and an explanation will be found there. What about us, simple people that don't dabble in Kabbalah? However, all Jews, as descendants of the patriarchs who believed in God, and we have that in our DNA, as we proved many times in Tanya, we are believers, descendants of believers, without any speculation of mortal intellect whatsoever. And they declare, you were the same before the world was created, and so forth. That's what we say, as has been explained above in chapter 2. So here's one place where the Alter Rebbe says, you know what, up until here, I'm going to explain. Beyond here, either go to Kabbalah and try to figure it out, but you don't need that to live with this. We are capable of living with this paradox that God sees everything and knows everything because he's embedded within us and invested in us, and at the same time is totally unaffected by us. And the fact that we can't do that should not lead us to the conclusion that God can't do that. If he is God, if he is the creator, then the fact that you can't do it should not be a proof that he can't do it. It just proves that you can't understand how he can do it. Yeah. I once heard from an elder chassid that there was a non-chassid who came to the Rebbe's Farbrengen, and he was blown away by the fact that the Rebbe would speak one talk all about the concept in Torah, which was logical as a genius, but with such human genius and logic. And the next talk, the Rebbe was talking about an issue affecting faith, and the Rebbe would talk like an old grandmother. And it was like with this simplistic faith of what we will stereotype the faith of an old woman. To have both of those that ability to know up until where it goes, and then above that is faith. Now, the faith, the threshold you had for faith when you were 5 years old is different than 10 years old, and 50 years old is different than 7 years old. The more we study and the more we work hard, the higher that threshold goes. But there will always be a threshold above which it's faith, because you're a creation and you're trying to understand a creator. Imagine the washing machine trying to understand the person who created it. It's nonsense. It's crazy, right? Because that's what it is. It's not my 5-year-old trying to understand me, because one day he'll beat me. He may even be smarter than me. We will never become God. We're like the washing machine, understanding its creator. That's a better analogy, even though they're both physical things. God created physics. So the analogy isn't even good because one day the robot washing machine may understand its creator, but it won't understand that there's always going to be some sort of comparison, whereas between us and God, there is no comparison. Yeah.
Okay. From what I've been reading, faith goes so far, then Bidacham kicks in, where you don't understand, but you have to have total trust.
Okay, let's bring that up when we're done, because it's not really relevant to this conversation. Okay. Anyone remember how we started this chapter? We started this chapter with a question. Yeah. First, we said there's a verse that says, Moses says of the Jewish people, what's God asking of you already? It's just to fear him. And we said, really? That's all it is? And the Talmud answers, yeah, for Moses it's little. And the question was, so what? I'm not Moses, and Moses is talking to me. Yeah. So what did we start explaining? In the first 2 weeks ago, we started explaining that yes, every person has a piece of Moses in him. And therefore, because you have a piece of Moses in you, for you to fear God is not such a big deal. Then last week we discussed how when we say fear of God, we're not talking about the full-blown emotion of fear that I actually start shivering and trembling when I think about God looking at me. We're talking about the meditation that leads to fear, the results of fear. In other words, thinking about the fact that God is always looking at me, knows everything that's going on, thinking about the fact that because of that, I better make sure I do the right thing. And as a result of that, actually being obedient, even if you don't have the emotion in a very strong way, that's also called fear. And therefore, fear of heaven is very simple, very easy. Because if I have a spark of Moses, then I could think about God and relate to it. And like I said, today, this is much easier. Today, all you have to do is look at the video camera in the corner of that room. See the video camera in the corner of the room? Everything that happens here is recorded, is known. Now, someone may not be looking at it now, but it's known. So is it that far-fetched to say that God is here and knows? Today, it's so much easier to appreciate that. So you can't think about it all day because you have to work, you have to sleep, you have to eat, you have to take care of your family. And if you're thinking about God watching me, then I'm not present and doing anything. But Alter Rebbe started chapter 41 with, we have to designate time every morning, once a day. Take a few minutes before davening and just sit down and think. Okay? Imagine that today you wake up and you're in public. You're not in your home. You're now in a hostel. Yeah, you're in a public place. Would you behave any differently? Would you be maybe a little more modest in the way you got dressed? Maybe you wouldn't get dressed in the middle of your room. You take your clothing and you go under your blankets and get dressed, or you go into the bathroom and get changed. So just because there's no physical people in your room, God is there. We haven't started learning the code of Jewish law, but that's in the very first chapter. When you wake up in the morning, there's an awareness that God is right there. So how could you continue laying in bed? If a king was standing there, would you not jump out of bed? If your wife was standing there and she needed you, would you not jump out of bed? If your children there, would you not? If your friend came in and saw at 9:30 in the morning the guy is still in bed, would you not jump out of bed? So ashamed. So is it that far-fetched to think God's right here? He created me. He has a purpose. He put me here for a mission. I owe him something, and I'm still sitting here in bed. Jump right out of bed. I want me to get undressed right in the middle of the room. That's disrespectful. All of the whole day, if that is the way I'm now, again, you can't, I shouldn't say you can't, but tzaddik maybe perhaps naturally thinks like that. But for us to have that meditation as we go along the day, we're never going to accomplish anything. But once a day, if the mindset becomes that, then decisions become a lot easier. There's a lot less struggle between the animal soul and the godly soul, and there's almost, after a while, a natural obedience to what God wants, because I know he's there all the time. He's writing everything down. Now, for one person, that may mean he's writing everything down, and therefore when I die, I want to go to heaven and not hell. Okay. It might be he's put me here for a purpose. Yeah. If my boss saw me sitting around twiddling my thumb, I'd be scared. Why? Because he hired me for a purpose, and I'm not doing that. God gave me life for a purpose. So as long as I'm not suicidal, I want to continue living. I want to continue doing what God put me here to do. So I'm not going to sit around twiddling my thumbs if God's watching, if the boss is watching. And therefore, to reach this level, that I have this simple meditation that leads to obedience, that, again, as we discussed last week, the Alter Rebbe is calling this fear of heaven, even if you don't actually feel fear. But that's what we mean by fear of heaven. The most basic level of fear is that I'm aware of the danger, so to speak, and therefore I'm going to act accordingly. I'm aware of the other's presence and I'm acting accordingly. We're calling that fear because that is the basic result of a basic fear. And that's very easy because every person can think for a few minutes. And because we have a piece of Moses, we can all relate because of the natural faith that we have. We relate to the fact, we can relate to the fact that God is present. He's not affected, but he's present and he cares. And therefore, my behavior is going to change. So going back to the beginning of chapter 41, when, remember, we've established in Tanya that we have to do what God wants, but we also need wings. And the wings are the love and fear. But which one comes first? Beginning of chapter 41, the Alter Rebbe said, the first you need a basic level of fear. Because without it, there's no obedience. You're not going to be a practicing Jew. Practicing, I mean, in its fullest meaning. I don't mean you can't be a practicing. Of course, every mitzvah you do is a beautiful thing and is an amazing thing. But in order to practice in order to do all the mitzvahs, you need to have the basic level of fear. And that's this knowledge that God is always present, God is always looking, knows everything, and therefore I better do what's right. And at the beginning, it might bring about traumatic feelings. It might feel like a monster, or not a monster. It might feel like this is exciting. Okay, you have to stick around for the next couple of chapters when we get to love and higher levels of fear. This is the first level, the most necessary basic level. Let's read this inside and then we'll the bottom of 642. Now, therefore, each individual Jew, whoever he may be, in other words, whatever his spiritual state, doesn't matter if you're the most religious Jew who lived his life in Torah, or someone who just found out he's Jewish. When he ponders upon this for a considerable time each day, what's this? How God is truly omnipresent in the higher and lower worlds, and that the actual heaven and earth, in other words, not only the spiritual heaven and earth, the supernal sphere, but the actual heaven and earth itself is truly filled with his glory. In other words, he's omnipresent, he's present everywhere, and that he looks, seeks, and searches his kidneys and heart. In other words, his is the person, his inner thoughts and emotions, and all his actions and words, and counts his every step. Then fear will be implanted in his heart throughout the day, even when he is occupied with other matters and cannot contemplate the above. When he will again, in other words, even during the day when he's not thinking about it because he's busy with other things, when he will again meditate on this, even with a superficial reflection that does not demand a particular effort and set time, at any time or moment, he will thus turn away from evil and do good. In other words, he will refrain from transgressing negative commands and perform positive commands in thought, speech, and deed, so as not to rebel, God forbid, in the sight of his glory, whereof the whole world is filled. This is the accord with the statement of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to his disciples, quoted above, may it be God's will that the fear of heaven be upon you and keep you from sinning, like the fear of human being, who by observing your actions keeps you from sinning. Yeah? In other words, we seem to be more afraid of people than God. And his wish to them was on his deathbed, they should fear heaven at least as much as they fear another person. This then is the meaning of the verse, God demands of you only to fear the Lord God, to walk in his ways. So it's only, it's a little thing, right? This is the first verse we started the chapter. For this, which fear is this verse referring to? For this is the fear that leads to the fulfillment of God's commandments, which involve turning away from evil and doing good. This is the lower level fear, which has been discussed earlier. As it applies to Moses, that is to say, in relation to the quality of Das that is in the divine soul of every Jew, this quality being the quality of Moses found within you, within each Jewish soul, this is indeed a minor thing. And as has been stated above, that when a Jew reflects with his Das upon matters that arouse fear of God, he will surely succeed in attaining it. For Das is the faculty which connects the hidden understanding of the heart with revelation and actual thought, as is known to the students of faith. In other words, the fact that we can be comfortable understanding something that we don't understand is the quality of das that connects our innate faith with revealed intellect. Now, in other words, what I've been saying is like this. When you encounter a challenge during the day, where I have two options, I can either do something God wants me to do now, or I want to do it. And it becomes a struggle. You want to go to shul, you want to go to the class, you want to put on tefillin, you want to light the candles, you want to eat the kosher, whatever you want to do. But it's not meaningful. You didn't do it yesterday, and you may not do it tomorrow, or it's difficult, or I'm not in the mood, or it's costly, whatever else your animal soul pops up. And they may be very silly arguments, but they're more a relatable argument, right? This is the way I am, so to speak. If in that moment you're going to try and use this meditation, it'll feel a lot more difficult. Because now there's a fight already going on, and it's too hard to sit down in the middle of a fight and start meditating. It's much easier just to give in and move on. But if at the beginning of the day, before you start praying is the language Tanya uses, what it means is the beginning of the day. The beginning of the day, you spend a few minutes when you're not in a battle. You're enjoying your coffee and sitting outside, and it's good. Now you spend a few minutes meditating about God's presence in my life. Then, once that foundation is established, then later on in the day, you're not going to have to go through a battle anymore. It'll take a split second just remembering the meditation you had earlier the day and how good it made you feel then, that now you're going to remember, you know what, I'm actually going to feel much better if I don't give in to my animal soul. If I get up and go out and do the mitzvah, I'm going to feel much better with myself afterwards because I meditated about it at the beginning of the day. So now it's not a fight, and it'll be much more easier to remember that in a moment, and you won't have to go through the whole meditation, that which probably take much longer to get you to the desired result. And this is the natural state of every Jew. Of course, if you haven't exercised this in a long time and you aren't used to it, it may be a little more difficult. But with not too much effort, God says this is easy. It's simple. With not too much effort, this can be accomplished. And you know that you can do this. Think about the things that you've got yourself to do during your life, all of the routines you've gotten into that you didn't want to start, all the exercise you did that you didn't want to do, all the dieting you did that you didn't want to do, everything you gave up for your kids that if you would have had a logical conversation, and when you did, you perhaps weren't ready to give up, but in an instant you gave it up because you came to the realization, this will make me feel better. This will make me feel more fulfilled. This will bring me more happiness if I do it. And therefore it became easier to let go of all of those things that was hard to let go of. Using the same meditation can accomplish the same thing here. God is abstract. Yeah, but we have the das of Moses. We have the piece of Moses. We have that Jewish soul that isn't convinced God is out there. The depth of our soul is a little bit convinced that God is more present. We just have to facilitate that. But our soul has that itchy feeling. How do I know that? Because when you put a sword to it, and you put a cross to it, it chooses the sword. That's how I know it's there. Problem is, not the problem. The challenge is waking it up and making it more active. All right.